Up to 1 million refugees may be heading to Germany this year, but Sweden takes in the highest number of refugees per capita in Europe. You may have heard us make reference to the term no-go zones. These are urban areas in Sweden allegedly so overrun by migrant violence that even police are instructed not to patrol there. Sweden has a gun problem. The number of fatal shootings in the country more than doubled between 2013 and 2023, and it now has the second highest rate of gun crime deaths in Europe. Sweden, a country that once flew the flag for open-door migrant policy. But the Scandinavian nation has now done a dramatic U-turn, introducing border controls and tighter legislation to build one of the most restrictive asylum policies in Europe. This is Sweden, a country of over 10.5 million people that for decades was the poster child of humanitarian immigration policy. Some would say the country that opened its arms wider than anyone else in Europe. Sweden received the third highest number of asylum applications in 2015, but it didn't send people packing. Nope. At the peak of the refugee crisis, Sweden took in 163,000 asylum seekers, the most per capita in the entire European Union. But first, Sweden has received more refugees per capita than any other European country, and the government is proud of its open-door policy. Politicians talked about Sweden's moral duty. Regular Swedes opened their homes to refugees. The world looked at Sweden as the model of compassion. But today, they've done a complete 180, and the results are shocking. In 2024, Sweden granted asylum to just 6,250 people. That's a 93% drop from 2016. Asylum applications fell to under 10,000, the lowest since 1996. And here's the really wild part. For the first time in over 50 years, more people are leaving Sweden than coming in. Sweden now has negative net migration. The Swedish government calls this a paradigm shift. They're not even hiding it. The goal is simple. Cut asylum immigration to the bare minimum allowed under EU law. Make Sweden as unattractive as possible for asylum seekers. And if you're already here but not integrating, we'll pay you to leave. Take the money and leave, please. The Swedish government is offering to pay immigrants $34,000 if they go back to their home country. This isn't some far-right fantasy. This is official policy backed by multiple parties, supported by most of the Swedish public, and it's working, at least by the numbers. So, what happened? How did one of the world's most liberal countries become one of the strictest on immigration? And has Sweden actually solved its immigration crisis or just created new problems? Today on Across the Globe, we're breaking down Sweden's radical transformation, the policies that shocked Europe, the results that nobody saw coming, and what it means for the future of immigration worldwide. So first things first, let's go back to understand just how intense this change really is. For most of modern history, Sweden prided itself on being a refuge. After World War II, the country built a reputation for humanitarian values. During the Cold War, they took in dissidents from Eastern Europe. In the 1990s, they welcomed refugees from Yugoslavia. In the 2000s, people fleeing Iraq and Somalia found safety in Sweden. This was their identity. Sweden saw itself as morally superior, a beacon of hope in a world that more often than not turned refugees away. Permanent residency for recognized refugees was the norm. Family reunification was generous. Integration programs were well funded. By 2015, when war in Syria sparked the worst refugee crisis since World War II, food is running short for many of the 11 million people who have lost their homes in Syria. Sweden stepped up in a way no other country did. While most of Europe panicked and closed borders, Sweden technically threw its doors open. As we mentioned earlier, 163,000 asylum seekers arrived that year. In a country of just over 10 million people, that's like the United States taking in over 5 million refugees in a single year. Swedish citizens donated clothes, volunteered at refugee centers, even housed families in their own homes. Sweden was showing the world how it should be done. Politicians from across the spectrum supported the policy. This was Sweden at its humanitarian best, but it was also the beginning of the end for Sweden's open-door policy, because what happened next would change everything. The problem wasn't the refugees arriving in 2015. It was what happened after. Sweden suddenly had hundreds of thousands of new arrivals who needed housing, language training, job placement, and integration into a homogeneous Nordic society. And simply put, the system couldn't handle it. Refugee housing centers popped up in small towns that had never seen diversity before. Local governments were overwhelmed, suddenly expected to provide services, education, and housing for hundreds or thousands of newcomers with no advanced planning. Ethnic enclaves formed quickly in suburbs around Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. Areas like Rinkeby, Tinsta, and Rosenard became heavily immigrant-dominated neighborhoods where Swedish was rarely spoken on the streets. Refugee unemployment remained absurdly high because many were unable to find employment that suited their skills, and many had difficulty learning the Swedish language despite it being widely considered as one of the easiest languages to learn. Others experienced hiring prejudice. Some towns became reliant on welfare, which caused conflict with native Swedes, who felt their taxes were being used to support non-economically active individuals. Fundamentally, the reality was clashing with the ideal of successful integration, and then the crime started. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, gang violence exploded in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods, shootings, bombings, organized crime, and this quickly began spreading from the major cities to the smaller suburbs and towns. I don't know exactly what happened with our society, and I don't know how they lost control over certain areas, but they did. But this wasn't typical European crime. This was something Sweden had never experienced before. We're talking about hand grenades being thrown in residential areas, drive-by shootings in broad daylight, bombings targeting rival gang members that sometimes killed innocent bystanders. In 2022 alone, there were over 60 fatal shootings in Sweden. For a country of 10 million people, that's shocking. As a result, Sweden's gun homicide rate became one of the highest in Europe, second only to Albania. This means that Stockholm's per capita gun murder rate in 2022 was about 30 times higher than London's. Let that sink in. Stockholm, a Nordic capital known for safety and order, had become more dangerous than London when it came to gun violence. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson said it himself. Sweden has never seen anything like this. These weren't random crimes. They were gang wars, often involving young men from immigrant backgrounds fighting over drug territory in the suburbs. We're talking about heavily organized criminal networks, many with roots in the Balkans, Middle East, or North Africa, who had established themselves in Sweden's immigrant communities. The perpetrators were very often second-generation immigrants, people born in Sweden to refugee parents who'd never fully integrated into Swedish society. How did it get to this? Why was crime becoming so wild? Well, police were overwhelmed. While the forest has a large number of employees overall, around 34,000 in 2020, the number of officers per 100,000 inhabitants, 209, is lower than the EU average. But also witnesses were too scared to testify, and some neighborhoods became no-go zones where emergency services hesitated to enter without police backup. The contrast with Sweden's image as a safe, peaceful country couldn't have been sharper. The Swedish public watched their orderly society unravel, and they demanded change. In September 2022, Swedish voters delivered a verdict. The Sweden Democrats, a party with roots in neo-Nazi movements that have been treated as political outcasts for decades, won 20.5% of the vote. That made them the second largest party in parliament. This was a party that just 10 years earlier was winning single digits. Now they were in second place. So for the first time, the anti-immigration far-right had real power, and they knew exactly what they wanted. Conservative leader Ulf Kristersson became prime minister, but only with Sweden Democrat support. He needed them to form a government, and they had demands, big ones. In October 2022, 4 parties met at the Tito Castle and hammered out a deal called the Tito Agreement. It gave the Sweden Democrats massive influence over immigration policy in exchange for their backing of the government. The Sweden Democrats didn't get ministerial positions. They were still too controversial for that, but they got something better: control over the policy agenda on immigration. Essentially, they got to write the playbook. The agreement was explicit. Its goal was to create a paradigm shift on migration and adjust Swedish migration to the minimum level under EU law. Translation: Sweden would accept the absolute bare minimum of refugees it was legally required to take, nothing more. With that at play, the days of Sweden as a humanitarian leader were officially over. Even mainstream parties that had supported generous immigration policies for decades suddenly shifted right. The moderates, Christian Democrats, and liberals all signed on. The Social Democrats, Sweden's traditional center-left party, didn't oppose it strongly either. The message was clear across the political spectrum. The era of open doors was over. So, what did Sweden's new government actually do? Let's break down the policies. Temporary protection only. Sweden made it an official policy that asylum seekers only get temporary residence permits. No more pathway to permanent residency. As of 2025, the government is even exploring whether they can revoke existing permanent permits or convert them to temporary ones. The message here, refugee status in Sweden is not a path to settlement anymore. /refugee quotas. Sweden used to accept 5,000 UNHCR quota refugees per year. People taken directly from refugee camps who'd been vetted by the United Nations. These were often the most vulnerable refugees, torture survivors, persecuted minorities, people with serious medical needs. That number was cut to just 900, an 80% reduction. Sweden went from being one of the most generous resettlement countries to barely participating in the program. Asylum rejection skyrocketed in 2024. 7 out of 10 asylum seekers were rejected. The criteria for who qualifies as a refugee were extremely tightened. Humanitarian visas, which used to be granted for particularly distressing circumstances, were almost eliminated. Only children can qualify under exceptional hardship now. And even then, the criteria are narrow. Adults, they can pretty much forget it. Tougher family reunification. The government raised the minimum age for spousal immigration from 18 to 21 to prevent forced marriages. They also tightened income and housing requirements. Even recognized refugees must prove they can financially support family members before bringing them to Sweden. This directly limits family-based immigration, which used to be a major pathway, the EU minimum standard. Possibly most telling is Sweden's legal overhaul to meet only Europe's minimum requirements on asylum. The government commissioned a full review to ensure Swedish regulations are not more generous than required under EU law. Migration Minister Maria Malmer Sturgard put it bluntly herself with those exact words. So the country that once set the gold standard now aims for the bare minimum. Fast-tracked deportations. Sweden empowered authorities to expel people more quickly, especially those deemed security threats or lacking legal status. New laws make it easier to revoke residence permits if someone lied on their application or if conditions change in their home country. Foreign nationals involved in serious crime can now be deported more readily, even for offenses that previously wouldn't have led to removal, ending self-arranged housing. For 30 years, Sweden allowed asylum seekers to arrange their own housing, living with friends or family, renting privately while receiving financial support. It was called the EBO system. In March 2025, Sweden essentially killed this. A new law ties financial assistance directly to living in migration agency assigned accommodation. You can still technically choose to live elsewhere, but if you do, you lose your daily allowance and financial support completely. During 2024, thousands of asylum seekers living in private arrangements were given until August 31st to move into state facilities or forfeit their benefits. The goal? Keep them in designated centers where they're ready for swift deportation if their claims fail and prevent them from settling in vulnerable urban areas of their choosing. The snitch law. This is the most controversial proposal. Sweden wants to require public sector workers, teachers, doctors, social workers to report undocumented migrants to authorities. If an undocumented person shows up at a hospital or enrolls a child in school, staff would be legally obligated to inform the migration agency or police. The government says this will help locate and remove people with no right to stay. Critics call it utterly inhumane and say it will stop immigrant families from seeking health care or sending kids to school out of fear. But controversies aside, it's moving through the legislative process right now regardless, paying people to leave. Okay, here's maybe the wildest one. The Swedish government has promised to increase grants for immigrants who choose to leave the country and return to their home nations. Sweden aims to use 3 billion SEK, about $270 million, to pay immigrants to voluntarily leave the country. Starting in 2024, anyone who agreed to leave could get up to $350,000, roughly $34,000. That's up from the previous offer of 10,000 SEK. For many people from poor countries, that's life-changing money. Citizenship revocation. Sweden launched an inquiry into whether they can strip citizenship from naturalized citizens who obtained it by fraud or commit serious crimes. This is currently impossible under Swedish law, but the government wants to change that, targeting people involved in terrorism, serious national security threats, or gang crime. Even citizenship is no longer guaranteed if you abuse Swedish society. But Sweden didn't just close the doors to new arrivals. They completely changed how they handle immigrants already in the country. The new philosophy is simple. Sweden will give you opportunities, but you have to put in the effort. So let's quickly break these steps down as well. First off, Swedish language skills are now mandatory and enforced in schools. There's also discussion of requiring a language and civics test for citizenship, something Sweden avoided for a long time. Welfare rules are being overhauled to ensure work always pays more than benefits, with a benefit ceiling being considered to cap total. Handouts. To help fund all this, Sweden slashed its traditionally generous international aid budget by over 50% in 2023, redirecting billions from overseas development to domestic issues. Again, the message is clear. Integration is now demand-based. Learn Swedish, find work, adopt local norms, or face consequences. So, after all of these policies, what actually happened? Well, the numbers are serious. Let's take a deeper look. In 2024, Sweden issued just 6,250 asylum-related residence permits. That's the lowest since at least 1985. For context, Sweden approved over 86,000 such permits in 2016. Applications are similarly low, under 10,000 in 2024. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. In 2024, total asylum requests in Europe topped 1 million, nearing 2015 crisis levels. While asylum seekers surged across the continent, Sweden's numbers kept dropping. Sweden effectively opted out of the migration surge through its strict measures. What about negative net migration? Well, for the first time since the 1970s, more people are leaving Sweden than coming in. In early 2024, Sweden had negative net migration. Immigration rose notably among people born in Iraq, Somalia, and Syria, to the point that those communities experienced net population loss. Some are returning home, others are leaving for third countries in the middle of Sweden's harsher climate for immigrants. The migration minister hailed this as necessary to strengthen immigration. So, Sweden has effectively stemmed the influx and reversed the migratory tide, something no other major Western European nation has achieved in recent times. But what does the general public think about all this? Despite how extreme these policies sound, they're popular. By 2023, 73% of Swedes said immigration in the past decade was too high and a problem for the country. Immigration jumped to a top-tier voter issue. The 2022 election was effectively a referendum on law and order and migration, and a majority voted for parties promising a crackdown. But of course, not everyone thinks this is a success story. Human rights groups have sounded alarms. Amnesty International Sweden stated that thousands of homeless and destitute EU migrants, mostly of Roma origin, are living in desperate and dangerous situations across the country, and warned that many measures put in place risk seriously harming the rule of law and stigmatizing non-Swiss citizens. Civil rights defenders noted that several proposals clearly breach human rights norms. Sweden is committed to the snitch law, requiring teachers and doctors to report undocumented migrants, has provoked outcry from educators and healthcare professionals who say it betrays their professional ethics and eats away at trust. There are also practical concerns. Labor shortages are coming up. Sweden's population growth, previously driven by immigration, is slowing. Industries like tech and elder care that rely on foreign talent worry the climate is becoming too hostile even for skilled immigrants. And then there's the question of social cohesion. Will these hard policies integrate communities or further alienate those who feel targeted? The push for assimilation could reduce segregation over time, but in the short term, it's provoked anger among immigrant advocates. And here's the thing many people don't talk about enough. Sweden's transformation is part of a broader European trend. Denmark pioneered many of these policies. The Netherlands is following suit. Even Germany has tightened border controls. But Sweden is different because of how far it's fallen. This was a humanitarian superpower, the moral leader, the country other nations look to as an example of compassion and openness. And now Sweden is racing to be as restrictive as Hungary or Denmark. The government frames it as responsible and sustainable in the long term, redefining Sweden as a country for labor immigration rather than asylum immigration. Politicians in other countries are pointing to Sweden's turnaround to argue for their own crackdowns. When it all boils down to it, Sweden has gone from a cautionary tale of naive generosity to an example of how to get tough and halt a migration crisis. So, we got to ask, has Sweden actually solved its immigration crisis? By the numbers, as you probably understand by now, yes, asylum applications are at historic lows. Net migration is negative. The influx has stopped. But at what cost? Sweden has gone from accepting 163,000 asylum seekers in 2015 to just 6,250 in 2024. They're paying immigrants $34,000 to leave. They're requiring teachers to report undocumented children. They're exploring stripping citizenship from naturalized citizens. The Sweden of 2025 is not the same Sweden we saw in 2015. A country that once threw open its doors has put up high barriers. A society known for humanitarian values now actively discourages asylum seekers. Supporters say Sweden is finally addressing problems of crime, segregation, and failed integration that were ignored for too long. They point to falling asylum numbers and improving security as proof the policies work. Critics warn that Sweden is undermining its own values of openness and equality, that it's turning away people in genuine need, that the harsh measures will create new social divisions. The truth, it's too early to tell. Essentially, Sweden is conducting a high-stakes experiment. Can reversing immigration and doubling down on enforcement restore social harmony? Will gang violence decrease? Will integration improve? Or will new problems emerge? One thing is certain. Sweden has shown the world that even the most liberal societies will swing hard the other way when integration fails, and public patience runs out. The pendulum has swung, and it's swung far. The world is watching to see if Sweden's unprecedented crackdown truly delivers the safer, more integrated society its architects promise, or if it's just trading one set of problems for another. What about why Denmark is suddenly declaring war on immigration? Subscribe to our channel Earth Explorer Hub for more interesting facts around the Woolard.